And it is now my pleasure to kick off our panel discussion for today. Our speakers are Dr. Peter Aiken, author of The Case for the Chief Data Officer, Dan Morgan, Chief Data Officer at the Department of Transportation, and Scott Shoup, Chief Data Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Our moderator for this morning's panel is Jack Moore, and Jack has really been writing, he is the Nextgov news editor, he's really been writing most of our articles on the Chief Data Officer. And so Jack, with you, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Thanks, Connie. Jack Moore, news editor for Nextgov, and just wanted to give a little bit of a setup for this panel, why now? Since last summer, no fewer than 7 chief data officers at the large federal agencies, the CFO Act agencies, have been appointed. 2 of them join us on the stage today. This administration has really privileged data-driven decision-making. That's something that you'll hear a lot if you peruse budget documents, as I think everybody on the stage does. And just this past winter, the White House named the first government-wide chief data scientist, DJ Patil from Salesforce. So clearly there's been increasing movement on this front. And a few months ago, we at Nextgov decided to take a look, see what the CDOs were up to, and we wrote a feature, The Rise of the Chief Data Officer. And it got so much feedback, and we kept hearing from people, and people wanted the conversation to continue. So that's what we're doing today, continuing the conversation. And in a little bit, we hope to expand the conversation to you out in the audience, ask questions. These are truly the experts. And so, if you have a question, jump in. I want to introduce the panel. We have Scott Shoup, the Chief Data Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, a longtime FEMA employee. Actually, he told me when he first started the agency, it was after the Northridge quake, and he was, on the ground helping people sign up for assistance. So he has a, deep internal view of the agency. To his left is Dan Morgan, the Chief Data Officer of the Transportation Department. He is a former contractor at Transportation working on enterprise architecture and IT governance. Before that was a supply chain analyst for the Navy, one of the sharpest thinkers on the kind of the philosophical role of the Chief Data Officer. He's taught me a lot about this role. And to his left is another leading authority on the Chief Data Officer in private sector and in government, Dr. Peter Aiken, founder of the Data Blueprint Data Management Consultancy, and also author of The Case for the Chief Data Officer. So with that long-winded introduction, and we've already, this morning, we've already had references to drugs and alcohol, so we'll try to keep it family-friendly for this panel. So if you could, we'll go down the line. Scott, just tell me about the Chief Data Officer role at FEMA. How are you approaching the role, and what conversations have you had with senior leadership about what they want the role to be?
Well, first of all, I want to say excellent job by the previous 2 presenters. Hit a lot of the key marks, so I hope you really took that to heart. The CTO jokes, I've been doing a lot of these the last couple months, and I feel like I need new material now after the first 2 presenters. He's been calling me Miley Cyrus, because you got to take it up a notch, get more and more dramatic every time you present in something like this. So the CDO position at FEMA, as you saw earlier, really came out of strong senior leadership. We have a strong deputy administrator with a technical background. We have a new CDO, a CIO from NASA, and our chief technology officer came from Microsoft Humanitarian Services. So they really brought a business approach to things and really saw, as I'm sure your organizations are going through, an explosion in the need for analytics to do data-driven decision-making. It's actually literally strategic objective 5.2 for FEMA right now. We have small analytics groups popping up across the organization. I see one of them in the crowd today. So what that led was the senior leaders realized we needed a central person. And I'll be honest with you, and Micheline had a great logo for her office, which is one of the things that impressed me the most about her slide deck. It is part of a brand, and what you do is the CDO basically is your evangelist and your champion to talk about the importance of data management, specifically around analytics. Analytics is prevalent in everything we do, and the federal government needs to go there. So I was in enterprise architecture, so it made sense for me. For the last 6 or 7 years, I started FEMA's data warehouse, so the word data came up, and people were like, well, Scott can handle it. But the word data is too prevalent, right? And you can't have one person for that. So they put me in the position of CDO, and really it's just one more. I have a bachelor's degree in sociology. And what that got me was a telemarketing job and a position at a front desk at a hotel, right? But now I've come to realize how critical that decision was, because it's a social change. It's about being somebody that brings these concepts that you've seen and brings them to the organization and sells them and implements them. So Micheline said we're not used car salesmen, but we kind of are. But what we're selling is data management, data quality, data governance, data analytics, and data-driven decision-making.
Dan.
So it'll be almost a year that I've been doing this chief data officer thing. I think it's pretty true that, I thought I had a plan when I walked in the door, and all plans, get thrown out the window pretty quickly. About every data problem in the organization has been laid at my doorstep. So there's lots of challenges that we have. The business of transportation is changing, right? We're putting in NextGen at the Federal Aviation Administration. It's going to change the amount of data that we're able to gather to help you move more efficiently in the skies and keep you safe, right? There's connected cars, right? And we're working to build regulations that help cars talk to each other and talk to infrastructure to keep you safe on the road. We have so much that we are trying to do to improve how we make investments, right? The department itself embarked on this big study called Beyond Traffic. Was really trying to look at the broad trends that are really changing the transportation space, right? We've got a ticker up on our website about how the Highway Trust Fund is going to go broke. And we're trying to figure out how to make the most out of the money that we collect through the gas tax, right? So what we learned really was that somebody's full-time job needed to be on data so that we could make it better and put it to work. And that means a lot of different things, right? I've always broken it down into 3 tracks. Govern, right? So all the good stuff that we learn in enterprise information management class, right? It's a pretty settled science, but it's a really hard social science, right? Mm-hmm. How do you organize an organization to actually make a decision about how they can invest in data and make it better and make it more fluid? There's the engagement piece, so all of the open data stuff and data jams, data paloozas, but that engagement is also internal, right? We talk a lot about data as an asset, but data is a product too, right? When we're shipping it around to the organization and other people are using it, you have to manage the product. You're not just providing an authoritative data source, you're providing a service to the organization. And this product management mentality needs to come into the space of enterprise information management because you have to ship. You're not going to make a decision if your data is stuck in a legacy system. So you have to change the mentality. And then the technology enablement piece, I think everybody's trying to do an innovation lab or some sort of thing on big data. And certainly that's something that we're trying to look at the department.
And Peter, maybe give us a kind of state of the play with CDOs in federal government. In so many areas, the narrative is, the private sector is light years ahead and government is struggling to keep up. Is that the case here?
No, and it's actually kind of fun. So I go back in the federal government. I was a GS-14 in DISA SIM. Anybody remember that in the early 90s? Okay, got a couple of hands up there. DISA SIM was the group in the DoD that created the first enterprise architecture for the federal government, and it's still in use 25 years later. I've got authoritative measurements, quantitative measurements on more than 500 data management practices, and the federal government is in fact outperforming the private sector. So it's fine to say, federal government beat up on them and all this sort of thing, but as a former Govy and as a person who studies these areas, federal government is actually leading the way. We've had laws in effect. I authored part of Klinger-Cohen back in those days that said it's against the law to not do the things that you're talking about, which didn't help us a whole lot because we also were trying out of the geek community to try and, say these things are important because you need to normalize these things, right? Anthony, your PhD is in leadership? Yeah. Right? That's the kind of thing that needs to happen. The social work behavior that you referenced earlier, Scott, is incredibly important to these aspects of it. Now, let's take this to what the role of chief means, though, really, and this is really where it comes down to it. We have a chief financial officer. They're responsible for the physical assets of the organization, and we expect those people to have certain qualifications, unless your company name was Enron. Somebody remembers that, some people don't. We have a chief risk officer in organizations, and they have studied risk. They have certain qualifications. We have chief medical officer, and we don't ask the chief medical officer to go and perform surgery in most cases for organizations. Data is an asset, and you said that very well, Dan. You talked about how to productize it. But if we don't have somebody treating it as the asset, then we will never be able to have the recognition of the power that comes. And I don't know if you noticed on one of Micheline's slides, but it said there, we will never have less data than we have more right at this point in time, right? That's an interesting thing to think about, and of course it's going to continue to go up from there. So the goal here is to put something in place where we can get a handle on this asset and to start treating it as an asset instead of as a byproduct, which is what too often IT has treated it as. Let me make one more point here before we dive back in, and that is that the other thing we cannot do with data is treat it as a project. And unfortunately, we spent the last 10, 15 years trying to teach IT how to do project management better, and that's a good thing. Right, that has improved the quality of our IT outcomes over the years. But if you try to fit data into a project piece, the only possible outcome are more small piles of data that are lying around. This is true with Agile, it's true with Scrum, it's true with all of the things that we're trying to do in terms of developing this. Agile and Scrum are great ways to develop software, but if you try to develop data at the same time you're trying to develop your software, the outcome will be more small piles of data. And that's a wonderful thing, because then I'll have you guys as a customer, right? Small pitch, right? By the way, if you want a copy of the book that Jack mentioned earlier, come up here afterwards. I've got a piece of paper you can sign up for. We'll give you an evaluation copy of the book as well.
Scott and Dan, I'm wondering if, we're talking data, could you, bring it down to a ground level, tell us what specifically you're working with, and how can you, what does it mean to manage it, or is it kind of standardizing a format so you can use it again, or are you marrying up data sets to, kind of get new insights into something? Kind of give us some specifics about what we're talking about here.
I'll go first. So I think we've talked a lot about data analysts and the scientist role, and I think for the chief data officer, in reference to what you say, Jack, we're talking about championing the availability and the quality and the management of the data. We want to empower those analysts and those data scientists and those researchers to be able to create quality decisions and create those outcomes. So I'm working on better metadata repository. We're working on making sure we have a strong data inventory. Data quality is huge. We want to be able to, we have data governance now that started in October with FEMA. We're working on data stewardship. We're trying to move things from managing them from a database owner perspective to families or classifications of data that span all of your systems. And again, it's that social change perspective. But really what we want to do is empower the people that are working with the data on a regular basis in order to be able to make those decisions. And it's not about, I know that's maybe a later question, it's not about the tools. I'm not worried about a lot of heavy tools. You do have to have tools. We will have to have a metadata repository of some type, but an Excel spreadsheet is still better than what a lot of organizations may have now. So you want to look at ideas, people first, and the ideas they generate, and then the tools are really later if you can help it.
And Scott, real quickly, what kind of data does FEMA collect? Give us an idea of what information it really
Yeah,
tells.
so unlike earlier, we're really looking at the full spectrum of FEMA's data, because what we're trying to do is do a lot better with both trend analysis and predictive forecasting around emergency management. FEMA is effectively a grants organization where we provide either grants before, during, or after a disaster in order to empower our emergency management partners and help individuals and public entities. But what we haven't done that we need to do better, which I really feel is my primary role, is look across that whole life cycle. We have the flood insurance program in Crystal City. We have preparedness up at 800 K Street. We have a lot of our recovery systems are spread around the country for resiliency purposes. We're not looking at that whole broad spectrum. How does an early preparedness project that we fund today affect a disaster in 15 years? So what I need to do is get all of the data, even human resource data. How does the way in which we deploy our intermittent disaster employees to a disaster truly affect the outcome? You know, because unfortunately for FEMA, ever since Katrina, our mantra, we go three ways. We go big, and then go big. Because we can't go smart, because we know that we have to make sure that since Katrina, let's face it, we have to really make sure we hit the mark. Well, we've gotten to the point now where we really need to rethink that. So we need to figure out if sending 300 people to a disaster is really, truly effective. Maybe we have 120 and we do it smarter. So it's all of our data, financial data, it's all of it.
So to oversimplify the Department of Transportation, we're an operator. So the reason you can track where your plane is, right, is because the FAA is good at open data, right? We also operate the St. Lawrence Seaway, so we have the operational data, all those radar hits, all that data about where the planes are and how they're doing and all that good stuff, right? We have regulatory data, so roadside inspections. When you see a truck pulled over at one of those stations getting inspected, that's us and our state partners. We've got we've got the largest vehicle recall in the nation's history going on, right, with the Takata airbags. 34 million cars. There are 250 million cars on the road. It's huge. We provide the data for that. We try to get that data in as many people's hands as possible so that they can take an action to keep their family safe, right? We have regulatory inspection data on pipeline and hazmat safety and railroad safety, and all that data is open and available. It's available in a variety of formats and a variety of tools and a variety of websites. It's super hard to find, and even my own organization doesn't know where it is, right? So we're working on trying to improve the discoverability of that stuff. And we're a grant maker. We provide a lot of assistance to the states to help build your roads. We provide some guidance on how those roads should be built. There's a lot of data that feeds the highway design manual and some of the engineering things that go into how we build roads. We've got a lot of statistical data, long, large, fat statistical data sets around the condition and performance of the highway system and the aviation system and the marine transportation system. The marine transportation system's fun. There's like 30 federal agencies involved with the marine transportation system. So super hard to get all of those guys to talk correctly, right? And there's an operating, grant making, and regulatory aspect to that thing as well. So I think really what we're trying to do first and foremost is get our hands around that inventory, and then I would like to assess the condition of those assets, but the truth is they just need to be more fluid, and the condition will be assessed when they get put to work. I don't need to spend a lot of time admiring the problem of whether or not my data is quality. We'll figure it out when people can actually put it to work, and then we can organize governance around that.
And we heard from Micheline's keynote earlier that the role is really in flux, and there's really not, I mean, there's some models that you can look to, but there's not any one particular, there's a variety of ways people are approaching the role. And there's kind of a split between the chief data officers who are kind of looking at the data internally to improve internal operations, drive business efficiencies, and that's what Micheline said her role was really about. And in government, a separate factor is open data in terms of releasing the data to the public, to entrepreneurs, to an app maker. And Peter, I'm wondering, in your book, Case for the Chief Data Officer, you said it's important for a chief data officer to pick a priority in order to be successful. Can you do both, or do you really have to pick one and stick with it?
I think in some ways you can do both. Start off with what I consider three key priorities for a chief data officer, and these guys have alluded to it already. First is that your data, as it exists in your organizations now, is probably done very well at the work group level. Individual work groups are doing tremendous work. You mentioned the multitude of data sets that you have to deal with on there. Imagine what would happen if your agency was able to take all that and start to harness it at an agency level, bring true power to it. You do that through a data strategy. And the idea here is you have to make some strategic choices. Strategy is always about deciding trade-offs. If you go for innovation, you're going to have a different kind of mindset than you're going to have if you're going for efficiency and effectiveness. And that's the first type of trade-off that you have to make when you're looking at these things. Second thing that you need to look at as a chief data officer is reducing the amount of what we call rot in your organizational environment. Rot stands for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. Unfortunately, it's probably 80% of your data that's out there in that category. And so it's really just getting in the way, which is why you're not going to go in and try to improve the quality in all of it, because it doesn't make any sense if the data is redundant to make both of it better. Pick one and let's get started on it. The third piece of it, and this really goes back to the leadership function that was talked about in the previous section, is that you've got to start doing what I call monetizing that data. Although in the federal government, we're not always about money. Sometimes it's about bodies and saving lives and providing services and this sort of thing. For example, we did a real interesting project with USAID that's very similar to what you're looking at. How can they be more effective at what their mission is in terms of providing these types of ideas? Sharing those ideas back and forth and coming up with stories that leadership can grasp onto and say, oh yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. We don't actually need to go after it with an army. We can go after it with a SWAT team and come up with exactly the same types of results, or even perhaps better results around there.
And one of the other things that Micheline had mentioned is, the resources that are allotted to her office. She's been around for a while. She said she has nearly 50 data scientists or people, working on her team. Other agencies are, at an earlier place in their development. I know both Scott and Dan, you have been on the job for a year or less, so I don't think anybody expects you to have, be fully staffed up yet. But what, kind of give us where you are in terms of the maturity of your office and what you're able to do with that, and then also where you would like to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody knows that the budget process moves slower than you want it to do in the federal government, right? And so you try to you try to shift resources and be smart about how you do things. At the end of the day, I'm still a one-person office, but I do think my organization is serious about making an investment in chief data officering and making our data better and work smarter. DOT is big. We're 60,000 people. There's 10 sub-organizations, right? Like, we're good at bureaucracy. It works. But that means that there's resources that exist inside the organization that help support us in improving the management and accessibility and quality of our data. And from that perspective, I work a lot with working groups, right? So, but I'm not just working with IT people, and this is super important. I'm in the CIO's organization. If you read the Paperwork Reduction Act of 1995, right, CIOs are supposed to have responsibility for the organization's information and the information resources. It's not just information resources. And there was nobody doing that. We were enterprise architecting and trying to be business driven, but nobody knows the business of the department. And we're not going to be successful if I'm sitting there behind my desk thinking really hard about what the best governance process is and writing a standard operating procedure that nobody wants to participate in, right? So I'm spending a lot of time with my business owners, helping them craft smarter questions, understand what their analytical needs are, working with our policy folks to understand how our data needs to line up with the way we want to be as a data-driven decision-making organization, what that really means for the department. Because there's really, we just had Transportation Data Palooza, and one of my favorite quotes from that two-day thing was, there's no substitute for a passionate question, right? Because that will organize the rest of what we need to do around data. And so I'm out there working with, our business and policy and mission and policy people, helping them understand helping them to form a better question that lines the IT people up to support them so we can get the data supply chain to work in advance of what we actually need to get done.
And Scott, tell us more about your office. Are you a one-man band at this point? Or
Right, yeah, so I'm in enterprise architecture. I work for the CIO and the chief architect. But I will say, while I'm one person and I don't know what the office's structure will look like, we have a network across the organization. So we have staff in recovery that are part of an analytics group that are working on the data inventory. We have cells of people that are doing data quality, like some of our analytics groups across the organization. We have somebody in one of our housing programs who in a previous life was an engineer, and he has a lot of modeling background. He did a lot of the CDM. Really, the only staff that I have directly under my purview is our FEMA Open Government Program. I'm the project manager for that as well. And a lot of things we're doing is to push. Dan made great. I mean, that's been a great theme this morning, because I think the future in terms of government success around data is making data available to our partners, especially in FEMA. In the next 30 to 40 years, the largest growth area for FEMA is private sector humanitarian groups and nonprofit organizations, particularly small ones, that crop up during especially large disasters. And we have to be able to do our data collection and push that data out to our partners to the largest extent possible, so that FEMA is not everything to everyone. Instead of bringing trucks of water to a disaster, we help big box stores by clearing the roads, so they bring the water. And we have to do that by synchronizing and providing good logistics data on what we have, understanding what they have. So it's really part of a whole network in order to facilitate that, but we don't necessarily envision us having an office of 100 people, because what we're going to do is organize a matrix across the organization of people that are already doing these like things. Today at noon, we have what's called the Analytics Community Brown Bag. We get together once a month with our analytics community of interest. It started out with a room of about 6 people, and we'll probably have about 20 people in the room and maybe another 20 or 25 people on the phone, people that hadn't talked before about data and analytics. We have 4 10-minute lightning round sessions, people just talking about what they're doing, maybe bringing a problem statement. So you can build those kinds of networks, because all the things we've talked about today are happening within your organization. You just have to be able to network those together, and as the data champion, the data officer, that's kind of your job. That's the way I look at it.
Jack, if I can make these guys feel a little better, I was recently brought into a top 10 bank, obviously private sector at this point, and their chief data officer was also a single individual who was told they would not be getting any staff or any budget, and that their job was to persuade, influence, cajole, and just basically convince other people that this was the right path to take. So you guys are not alone in that, struggle upwards. And I'm willing to bet you guys have actually gotten further than the individual I was working with that was there, not through any fault of their own. Although we could contrast that with another bank that has taken all their data functions, enterprise architecture, governance, and everything else, and put them under chief risk officer. So there's an interesting play as well. So we're seeing lots and lots of different things that are going on out there. We'll have to wait and watch and see what works.
Yeah. I mean, before we had CIOs or CDOs, there's plenty of people who have been doing data management stuff without this title for a long time, right? I'm like, the chief data officer title is a bunch of different things to different organizations. I mean, my CFO is kind of a data nerd, right? It's their job. And in the private sector, right, like we got ERPs because CFOs wanted them, not because CIOs were like, here, have SAP, right? There was a reason. There was a business reason for making sure that your financial data was right, because you were going to report earnings and you were going to be at risk, right? CFOs get it. Chief risk officers get it. Chief economists get it. They all get it. We're training all sorts of these folks to come out of school with the skills to put this data to work, right? But the organization is not positioned to provide them the data in a way that actually makes them successful. And that's the core of what we're trying to solve.
And Dan, you brought up title. I mean, this is Washington, so the title on your business card matters in some respects. How important could people be doing this kind of work without the title, which people, it sounds like, already are? And what does the title signal to the organization, perhaps? Anybody?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's, like I said, I talked about that logo earlier. Let's face it, it's a brand name, okay? And it's a brand name for data management. It's been absolutely critical in my organization. What it does is it allows people I didn't get it as much at first when the Chief Technology Officer, Ted Okada, kept going out of his way to saying we have Scott Shoup, the Chief Data Officer, on the call. And at first I was like, oh man, that makes me sound so, I don't know, why does he keep saying that? It was actually, I want to hide under the desk, right? But now I see what he was doing. He was applying that brand name that means something. And listen, the other thing he said when I came here this morning is I said, hey, you got any last minute advice? And he said, be humble and learn more than your audience. And so that's the other thing too, is we're all in this together, so I need to be learning about this constantly too. But having that brand and that moniker is absolutely critical. People start to pay attention to what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an indication of seriousness because the secretary is talking about the data that he needs, right? And the undersecretary is talking about how data needs to be driving policy. And our board of directors has given us all sorts of important mandates around managing the performance of the transportation system and getting the most for your federal gas tax dollar, right? I'm serious, right? And when the aviation system doesn't work because you're not getting the right data to move planes through the sky efficiently and safely, you feel it when you're stuck at the airport, right? It's a very real thing. And I think the trick here is we're having a conversation about what we need to do to improve at the policy and mission level, but then we're serious about it because there is a lightning rod for where all that stuff comes together and how we organize around those important questions.
And Peter, I know you have kind of agnostic about the title. It's really more what you're doing. Right?
Yeah, I wanted to call the book The Case for the Top Data Job, and my publisher said if you want to sell any copies at all, you'll change it to Chief Data Officer. But I absolutely agree. I've seen Enterprise Data Executive, I've seen Top Data Job, I've seen all kinds of things. The point is organizations know who does the data in their organizations, and they look to that person for leadership, and that person can reside at different levels in the organization. If you call it a Chief Data Officer, then there's an argument about do we need any more chiefs? Well, clearly your organizations have said yes, that's a worthwhile piece. We're going to try to get the second step, which is getting you some budget and staff, and that'll be the next recognition that it's not just a titular thing, but it's an actual function within the organization. You guys are going to, again, be the ones that are going to set that pace out because we don't have a critical mass yet to decide what's going to happen. It'll be fun to get together next year and see where we've gotten to on all this.
I mean, we're really good at titles in government, right? There's the senior accountable official who has a chief that's underneath them that has an office of a deputy chief assistant to the whatever, right? But there's somebody's full-time job is data, bottom line, right?
Yep. I was just remembering my title when I was in DISA was the U.S. Department of Defense Reverse Engineering Program Manager. And I was probably doing the same thing you guys were doing at the time anyway. So,
Peter, you hit on the idea of, there are skeptics out there that say, why do we, there's kind of a trend toward these kind of fill in the blank chief titles and why can't the CIO do this? So I think it would be helpful, to kind of address why do we need why can't the CIO do this, for example?
About 10% of the CIOs are doing this very well. About 10%. So I'll have some people that, I'll forget to make a disclaimer like that at the front of some of my talks, and I'll have somebody stand up in the back and say, so, I suck, huh? Right? Yeah, forget to make that disclaimer, you're going to end up in that situation. On the other hand, is 10% the number that we really want to, be successful with? No, we'd like it. Anybody happy in here with the way their data is being managed? Do you think they're optimal? Okay, it's a good sample size, right? These guys are available, right? And by the way, I mean that in the sense that in the federal government, it's a lot easier to share these successes than it is in the private sector. I get two banks together, and they're like, well, we can't talk to each other. You can talk about metadata. It's okay. It's really okay it's not against the law to talk about these things in there. But anyway, so about 10% are succeeding out there, and that's good. And they look at this and say, well, how else would you do it? But the other 90% do need some help, do need some error. And let's be frank, we haven't figured IT out. So, it's not really a good idea to expect that we would have figured out the data part of it as well. We've got a lot to learn in all these areas. The world's oldest profession, accounting, right, has literally several millennia of experience. When we talk about generally accepted accounting principles, they've been around. Double entry bookkeeping's been around as long as the Bible has been in print. Okay? That's a long time to get these traditions in place. We've been doing this about 100 years if we really stretch it. The British Secret Service is really where this started, when they figured out that they were at war with the rest of Europe and there were 14 million persons of German descent living in the United Kingdom. It would be a good idea to have a 3x5 index card on each of those people, and then how were they going to manage those 3x5 index cards? It just became a very challenging problem.
And what about the people who say, the federal government has just elevated the role of Chief Information Officer for a long time? They had authority on paper, but it was a struggle to, get a seat at the table. And now we're like pairing off, maybe something that what they should be doing.
So it's a good idea to empower people who are responsible for things anyway, right? I mean, that just makes sense. On the other hand, we do have to be careful about IT not really driving the business. We really want the business to specify what IT should be doing. And that's why if we have a choice, we always advocate the CDO being, or the CDO function, reporting up through the business rather than reporting through IT, because IT is project-oriented and is still struggling with a number of different tasks that they have as well. We don't want to complicate their lives. They're having enough trouble as it is. Let's get back on the business side. Let business understand that they really own the data. They're really responsible for the data. They're really the people who can tell you the cost of a data quality challenge that happens, an oopsie, a breach. Again, I have my OPM data out there somewhere now in China, right? And I'm sort of going, And interestingly, when Target lost my data, I got, this particular piece. When OPM did it, I can now put in my medical accounts, right? There's all sorts of things OPM is giving me to now monitor on there, which I'm a little happy about. Right.
Scott, I was wondering, could you maybe give me, what are some of your priorities, short-term and also long-term projects? Is there, when people say, what are you doing as Chief Data Officer of FEMA, is there a flagship initiative or a big project that you point to that you're trying to drive success on? Well,
and again, not to stress it too much, but we're kind of all in this together. So while I'm up here on the stage, we don't have all the answers either. So I can tell you what we're doing, and some of the things that are working for us is, yes, the Open Government Program is Open FEMA is kind of our flagship. It gives us the capability to have a conversation. But honestly, a lot about value in data management is about what I would call soft cost savings and soft cost avoidance. That 10 minutes you save for every employee in a day because you've automated a business intelligence report. That's hard to prove to a senior leader. So frankly, in order to show value, because a lot of these things are fragile, we have an administration change, we have this terrific deputy administrator and CIO, I don't know what's coming. So I'm looking for areas where I can show some short-term value, right? So latching on to a lot of our main modernization programs right now. We're going through a grants modernization, a financial modernization, and we're looking to redo the National Flood Insurance Program. Those have major impacts to the organization. So I've embedded myself the best I can with colleagues in enterprise architecture around being part of the conversation in the startup of those modernization plans, talking about the value of data management. But then the flip side also is working with analytics groups and answering every data question I possibly can. I had one yesterday. Somebody was looking at our declarations data, and she's looking at a human resources report and said, what's the data source for the declarations data? What data set should I use for the official source? Okay, the authoritative or single source of truth. Very simple question for me, but across the organization, that's all part of the learning mechanism. So that was the most important email I got all day yesterday, because I was able to show value. Even as the CDO, I was able to show value in terms of data management and knowing the single source of truth for one small but very important piece of data. So that's the short term. Long term is, of course, much more strategic. We want to modernize. We talk about Hadoop and the ecosystem, and I think the trend towards trying to move some of these things out of just being in the CIO shop. I've heard even CFOs, maybe it's follow the money. In my sociology degree, it was always about follow the money and follow the politics. That leads you to everything, right? So I could see a CDO being tied in with the CFO's office, or even in the administrator's front office, working with the chief of staff.
And Dan, maybe give us some short-term projects you're working on, and then also, is there a big kind of flagship initiative that you really want to drive progress on in the long term?
I think really what I want to be able to do is aggregate risk for experimenting with analytics at the department level. I want to seed this innovation lab concept and start to organize more around experiments and pilots and really drive the experimental enterprise concept, because, frankly, the business can tell us their requirements, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of this new analytical capability that we're trying to create, they don't know their requirements, right? And if I sit in this space and be like, well, just let me know, I'll be here in a couple of years saying the same thing, right? So we need to create this experimental culture and be able to support it. So that's really sort of the near term, trying to figure out how we can resource it effectively and really line up not only tools but also talent to provide the business with some chances to do it. I think, from a flagship perspective, I'm really hoping to try to get that product and asset mentality to work together inside the organization. I think it's not just the responsibility of the business, it's not just the responsibility of IT, it's got to work, you have to work together, it is a team sport, and you can allocate roles and responsibilities on a chart, and at the end of the day, people just need to be able to work together effectively. And we have to be in the business of taking care of our assets, but also making sure that we're treating them as products that are used across the organization, across other government organizations, right? You guys use our data all the time, right?
Right.
State and local governments use my data all the time to make an investment in your community, right? I use Commerce's data left and right, right? There's going to be more of this fluidity and access kind of problem. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get harder. But I need to be able to talk to the people who are trying to consume it and the people who are trying to provide it and make those connections most effectively.
Let me drop back into one more point. You've heard sandbox mentioned a couple times here. And what's most interesting about this focus on analytics in today's environment is that the best answer out of an analytics initiative is usually another question. Yep. And that drives IT crazy, right? Because they want to know those requirements. And you just said you could sit and wait for years and they would never get to it. So instead, what you're trying to do is foster a culture where IT can be more responsive and to say, this is the next answer that we want, and the next, and the next, and the next, which means their systems are going to have to go into that same fluid mode that you're describing there as well. And that's a very different mindset. We've never taught anybody how to build systems that way. Organizations are getting good at it, again, at the work group level, but we've got to inculcate that, I guess, if you will, at the organizational level to do better on it.
A little bit bigger picture for the future of the role. Peter, you've written a really interesting analogy that about perhaps showing that it's temporary or kind of transitory nature of the role, using the analogy of the chief electricity officer. Could you explain that?
So between 1880 and about 1920, if you were a CEO, your title was Chief Electrification Officer. Kind of an interesting thing. We don't have them anymore because we figured out how to do it, and we now don't need chief electrification officers. We simply assume that we can plug into the wall and do this. It's entirely possible that the CDO role will be a transitional role as well, and that 20, 40 years from now, we'll all be going, oh yeah, they were really stupid about how they used data back in the old days because they hadn't figured out how to do it. By the way, we don't teach data in any college curriculum outside of a few specialized data science courses. Every business student, every knowledge worker in the entire world should be getting a course in data as an asset. The only way that's going to change is if you all beat up on your local colleges and community colleges and start to put this in there, because the faculty right now don't see that there's any need for this. They don't see any problems. That's not a good situation.
Let's open it up for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll wait for the mics to get you so everybody can hear.
Is it on? Hi, I'm Lisa Jenkins. I'm with EPA, and so our agency has a lot of interaction with both DOT and FEMA. What I wanted to ask about was, as a chief data officer, it seems like the focus is very much internal to your own agency, although you have alluded to working with other feds. I was wondering what is needed for doing better federal cross-agency data management so that we, from a citizen-centric perspective, because citizens often don't even know what agency they're dealing with,
Right.
we can be more seamless to the citizens.
I'll take a shot at it because I strongly believe that transportation lives in a context. It lives in an environmental context. It lives in a land use context, right? I think I learned the other day that the drought in California has caused a shift in elevation, like a measurable multiple inches shift in elevation. Do you think that introduces some risks to the roads that are built on that geology and the pipelines that run over that geology, that maybe we might be concerned about that? How do we sense that and build the use cases around it? I think it's we're still very like work groupy and sort of, it's heroes work to get two agencies to talk to each other. And I don't know why, right? It's the most frustrating thing in my life. I get safety people together to talk about the safety data initiative. Safety people love to share. Sure, here's my data, right? They're awesome because they care and they can make it, they can totally draw that line. And their IT puts them in such a terrible place to actually be able to do that, that they're handing USB drives around and shipping hard drives to people. That sucks, and we have to fix that. I think to give you an answer that kind of answers your question, I think IT needs to get clear that the data wants to move. It's a requirement that the data be able to move securely and safely, right? Period. And then we need to fix this culture problem where it's heroes work to move across government.
And we need to embrace certain standards and protocols. So I don't know about you guys, but the Data Act's a really big deal for me right now. They are establishing a financial protocol and data sharing standard for the federal government. And wow, I'm pretty jealous that they're able to pull that off, and we're also interested, right? I've been dabbling in NEEM for 6 years. Great idea, really hard to get there. So I think that there's some things that'll come out through the White House and OMB over the years in terms of standards and protocols like the Data Act. We're seeing the light collectively in terms of data sharing. And so we need to do a good job implementing those things. FEMA, and this is coming for all of us. The Data Act's a big deal, but there's also part of FEMA appropriations for Sandy tied us to providing open government, to provide open data on our projects and our mission assignments. Before Open FEMA came in, we had our program offices posting PDFs on a daily basis. So that's really great for trend analysis, isn't it? Pull down a PDF of every day since Sandy and then do some data analysis. So we've turned those into machine-readable APIs based on our own internal data model, but with very strong metadata and instructions on its use. So those are the maturation steps. But eventually, I think the Data Act is really kind of revolutionary in that perspective.
And just those of you that are in the government that want to get together informally to discuss this, there is an informal group that's out there. I can announce it publicly here, but come up afterwards and I'll let you guys know what it is.
So this might be for Peter, and then you guys can comment in. I mean, my observation for on this, where people really took off in an organization that really kind of got it with data, it's like two factors. One was there was a burning desire. It sounds like, the Federal Reserve's in that category. So there's a problem that needed to be solved, and then they build an infrastructure to get there. And then the infrastructure was able to then drive all the other questions to be answered. Or it was someone who was really innovative, kind of got it, and then, drove it before it was needed, and then it came. And I look around as, across the government, you kind of don't see, you see those things. You stick a data officer in there, or chief data, a person of one. I mean, that's not going to change the culture. So the question is from your observations, I mean, the people who got the critical mass, to really turn what you're saying, because you guys are all talking about we should. So when is it going to be we are? What's the catalyst to drive an organization to actually get it, create the structure, figure that out, and then actually drive forward? So I'll just make one other comment, like the Data Act. I'm in a CFO arena. And the Data Act is, I mean, it's minor data, but the good thing about it is if you can force the infrastructure to be created with that Data Act, it turns into, okay, now that I'm doing the 2%, but I built the capability to do 100%, now you have it. So I think the biggest challenge is carving out the funds to build an infrastructure to actually get the critical mass to do data analytics across the whole organization.
So, Tim, your education, right? Okay, so how long you been there? 2 years, okay. Well, I could tell you stories about education 20 years ago, and the idea was, we'll build an IT architecture where they had a really strong data person who really wanted to do the right thing, but couldn't get any traction in there. And the other part was the helpers that they were getting in there. They weren't experienced enterprise architects. They didn't have, they're still there, okay? We won't mention any names then. Still trying. But really the passion is, and I think you described two models, right? One is that you've got a very passionate individual that does get to the top, or at least to a point of notoriety, or solves a problem. Again, they say there's nothing like focusing the mind like a noose in the morning, right? If something bad has happened and you've got to go up in front of a congressional inquiry committee the next day, right? You want to get your ducks in a row. And maybe it's not the next day, but there's a reporting requirement or something along those lines. So certainly that's an incentive-driven approach. The other part of it is that some of the organizations do over time get more successful, acquire more like-minded people, and then that becomes a critical mass on their end as well. So we've seen both sides happen. What we have to be careful of is again, if we build it, they will come. Right, that was sort of the mantra for many data warehouses. If we build this gigantic data warehouse, it's going to solve all of our problems, and we'll clean the data up after we put it.
It'll also be our enterprise service bus, and that was the enterprise data warehouse was the original unicorn.
Yep.
Right,
And I think on that note, we started with the unicorns. We're out of time. We're having to end it there. We're going to stick around, though. If you have additional questions, I'm sure any of these guys would be willing to chat with you afterwards. And thanks so much for attending.
Thanks for putting this on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Nextgov, Dun & Bradstreet, and our distinguished speakers, and you, our audience, thank you for joining us this morning. Just as a reminder, we do encourage your feedback, so please, so we can get really good future events to you, so please just fill out the evaluation form. And we will be discussing this at Nextgov Prime, which is September 9th. This will be an issue that we'll be talking about. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.